Hello guys, today we're going to learn a little bit about using the distributive property. So before we start, I want to remind you that some of the things I'm going to ask you to write in your notebook and some of the things I am not. We're going to start with a quick review of what the distributive property is, and you do not have to write this part down, but the distributive property is basically a math property that allows you to give out a factor at the beginning of a problem to each of the parts of the problem inside the parentheses. I think we've probably said it enough for you to remember that to distribute means that you have to give out something. So let's look at an example of the distributive property. I do want you to write this one down for me. So this is a really good example of the distributive property. You see that we have a factor that is here outside the parentheses, and then in this particular case we have two addends, A-D-D-E-N-D-S. The 2 plus the 6. So in order to complete this problem using the distributive property, we're going to distribute, and you might remember doing this, the 4 to the 2, and then we're going to distribute the 4 to the 6. So that literally means that we're going to do 4 times 2, and then we're going to do 4 times 6, and because there is an addition symbol, we're going to add the addition symbol back into our problem. So if we continue to solve this problem, 4 times 2 gives me 8, 4 times 6 gives me 24, and then when I add those two together, I get a total of 32. So this is the distributive property at work. Let's take a look at some additional examples. I do want you to write these two examples down in your notebook, and I want you to pause the video at this point and see if you can simplify these two expressions using the distributive property. Pause now. Okay, if you have unpaused your video, then I am going to assume that you have solved the first of these two expressions, which is 9 as a factor times the addends of 2 plus 5. So that literally means that we're going to give the 9 to the 2, and then we're going to give the 9 to the 5. And remember, this is a multiplication relationship because we have a factor outside of our parentheses. So 9 times 2 gives me 18 here. And 9 times 5 gives me 45 here. So when I add these two together, I get a total of 63. So hopefully you got that one correct. Let's move on to the second example, which was a factor of 3. And this time it's a little bit different, and I don't know if you caught on to that or not, but this time it's a little bit different because now we have a subtraction symbol in the middle of our problem instead of the addition symbol that we've been seeing. It's still the same concept. We still give the factor of the 3 to the 8, and we give the factor of the 3 to the 2. So let's go ahead and do that, and then we'll see if it all makes sense to you. So if you got this wrong, you do need to fix it. 3 times 8 would give me a total of 24. And of course 3 times 2 would give me a total of 6. And because there was a subtraction symbol, I'm going to copy that subtraction symbol down. And now we have a simple subtraction problem. 24 minus 6, which gives you 18. So I hope that makes sense for you. Remember to fix that in your notebook if you did not do it correctly. So you might be asking yourself, why are we going back over this? And we want to know, how does the distributive property work when we have variables in our problem instead of just whole numbers? So I want us to look at an example that looks like this one. And I want you to watch what happens, and I do want you to write this down in your notebook if you don't mind. So when we have these variables, this variable represents a number. So we work with it the same way that we would if it were a whole number. We're going to distribute the 4 to the x and the 4 to the 2. Now, if I have 4 times x, I can write that for x. I can multiply 4 times 2, and that gives me 8. I copy down my addition symbol. Now, here's where this is a little bit different than the problems we've done in the previous examples. You might remember that when we first started looking at algebra, we said sometimes you can't solve the problem. You can simplify it to make it smaller, but you can't solve it to get an answer. This problem has been simplified. I cannot combine any of these terms because I have a 4x and I have a constant of 8, which means I can't put these two numbers together. So this is the simplified version of this particular example problem. So I'm going to ask you to do these two problems in your notebook. I do want you to pause the video, solve them just like the example we just did, and then unpause the video and see if you got them correct. So pause now. Okay, if you're unpausing the video, I'm assuming that you have completed these two problems, and we're going to see if you got them correct. So we're going to start by distributing the 6 to the 3, and when I give the 6 to the 3, that's a factor, so that's 6 times 3, which gives me 18. And then I'm going to distribute the 6 to the b, which means I'm going to multiply the 6 times the b. So that gives me 6b. Because there's a plus symbol in the middle, then that means that my algebraic expression is simplified to 18 plus 6b. And I'm going to type that because that is horrible handwriting. So I want you to understand that this is what that says. Okay, let's do the next one, which is the second one that you should have done. And this one we're going to distribute the 10 to the r, and that's a factor given to the r, so that would be 10r. And then I'm going to distribute the 10 to the 3, and 10 groups of 3 would be 30. And then because there's a plus symbol, I'm going to add those two. I look at my two terms now and I say, okay, well this one is 10 with a variable of r. This one is a constant of 30, which means I cannot combine those two, so this is the simplified version. We're going to do 2 more examples, and these are harder, and you might notice that I have pulled in my calculator for this because I am going to allow you to use a calculator to solve these. Because what you might notice that's different about these is that we have these minus signs in front, which means technically these are negatives, and so we want to make sure that we accommodate for those when we do our problem. So let's start by just setting these up, and I do want you to copy these down into your notebook. So if you'll copy this one down before we start. And we're going to distribute this to the y. Well, we know that nothing is going to change. It's going to be a minus, hold on. It's going to be a minus 5y. But here's where it gets really interesting. I'm going to give the 5 to the 2. So I'm going to come over here to my calculator, and I want you to see what happens when I do this. I have a negative 5, and I'm going to multiply that by 2. And when I do, you notice that I have a negative 10. So you've got a couple of options. You can either leave the addition symbol in there if you want to, and then say, okay, that's a plus a negative 10, or you can remember what we talked about the other day, where if you end up with a negative term, you could choose to change that to a minus sign. I do want you to recognize it both ways. This means the same thing. This is plus a negative or just minus a 10, because essentially it's the same thing. Let's go ahead and do this problem too, because I want you to see what this looks like. So let's look at this one. We're going to distribute the 4 to the h to start with. So that would just be 4 h's. And then we're going to distribute the 4 to this number. And we're going to leave this as a -5, because remember, if we had boxed this out, it would look something like this, because remember, we always take the sign that's in front of the term or the constant. So we're going to go to our calculator and we're going to say, okay, we're doing 4 times a -5 in this case, and that tells me that it's a -20. So just like before, that means you could look at it two different ways. You could say, okay, well, that's a -20, or you could say it's 4h, and then plus, you would have to have a negative symbol in front of your 20 because it is a negative number. Both of those mean the same thing. You have to understand that. I hope this has been a useful tutorial for you. Feel free to go back and watch it if you need to make sure that you have all of the information in your notebook that you've been asked to put into your notebook before you move on. Thanks.